Curie moved with a goal-oriented determination along the sparkling walkways of Net Narrator station, very keen on keeping their vision focused on either the path ahead or on the lights playfully twinkling under their feet, not wishing to allow their gaze to wander directly next to them. Her current companion, Muin, Moore's middle child and only son, was walking a bit ahead of them at their request. They didn't want to accidentally involve him in any unnecessary drama. They also didn't want him to possibly get into trouble should one of his large steps accidentally hit one of the agitated, much smaller forms that were currently trying their best to keep up with the cyborg, despite a vast difference in general walking speed between their short, rather stubby legs and Curie's own long mechanical strides propelled by their large backwards legs. Both their Mish and Vor were struggling very hard as they attempted to remain on one level with Curie, all the while constantly trying to appeal to the cyborg in order to get them to stop and hear their parents out, which Curie was by no means intending to do.
"This is really getting out of hand, Calliome,"
Farian attempted to imperiously admonish them, though the effect was certainly lowered by the way their Mish was huffing, while they barely kept up with Curie.
"Do you know how much money and time your Korvac game has cost us already? Just because you want to act stubborn, your Vor and I—"
They didn't get to finish their sentence, as Korahoffer simultaneously attempted to reason with Curie, seemingly not entirely caring that their partner was already talking.
"We only want your best, Musha,"
the teal-coloured Terravelt said, in a truly pleading tone. After the cold and aggressive front they had tried to put up at the start, had long begun to deteriorate ever since the legal conflict between them had officially started.
"Can you not see that you are just hurting yourself? We just want you to be able to live without these constant burdens on you."
Curie kept their gaze locked straight ahead, refusing to dignify their behaviour with even so much as a look. "I have told and requested of you many times now that any and all communication between us is supposed to happen through our lawyers," they stated firmly with their mechanical voice, not switching to their more melodically sounding alternative, like they had done during so many of their conversations in the past. "We have heard all that we needed to during each other's testimonies. We have nothing to say to each other anymore." For Curie, that was the truth. They had made it very clear what they wanted and how they felt during their own pleas to the judge, handling the ongoing civil case between the cyborg and their parents. If they had listened, then they knew what Curie thought about what they were trying to suggest to them here. And if they didn't, it was hardly worth hearing them out in return because they most likely wouldn't listen to the answer yet again. With an outraged croak and a few flaps of their wings, Farian suddenly burst into a brief sprint, shooting ahead of Curie before turning and coming to a standstill a few measures ahead of the cyborg. Once there, the pink Terravelt then fully revealed their beautifully patterned wings that were covered in swirling shapes of black and orange, making themselves appear as large as at all possible.
"I will not let you forbid me my words, Calliome,"
Curie's Mish imperiously announced as they stood firm, stubbornly trying to block their child's path. That stubborn bravado wasn't all that it was made out to be, however, because despite their Mish's behaviour, Curie had absolutely no intentions of yielding to such a ridiculous display. Therefore, they simply kept approaching, keeping the pace of their stride steady as they came closer and closer to the attempted block in the road. And the closer the sharp tips of the cyborg's long legs of black metal came, the more Farian seemed to second-guess their course of action here. While their actual main body was rather close to the size of their original form, the enormous legs of Curie's metal rebirth certainly made them quite a bit bigger than your average Terravelt. And the strength wasn't even comparable anymore. There was no doubt that if they wanted to keep going, there was nothing that Farian could do to stop Curie in their tracks. Nothing at all. However, the sheer difference in physical ability quite obviously wasn't the only thing that worried Farian, as they got more and more hesitant while watching their child approach them. Slowly but surely, an expression emerged on their wide face that spoke not only of a certain fear of possibly getting walked over, but also of a certain building anticipation of disgust. Farian's eyes were soon drawn away from Curie's face, and instead fixated on the matte black surface of the metal covering the cyborg's entire body. they began to very mildly shudder at the sight, and that shudder grew ever intenser the closer Curie got.
Moocher, wait!
Korahoffer exclaimed in terror, and reached out as Curie was finally right in front of Farian and slowly began to take their next step. Farian flinched heavily away from the large metal leg as it extended, releasing a fearful, shrieking yelp as they covered their face with their arms protectively and cowered into themselves. The gesture was so far beyond a simple fear of possible pain. To avoid pain, it would have been much smarter to simply dodge the slowly moving leg, had it actually come for their body at all. But it wasn't something as rational as that. Curie could tell from vastly sourced experience. This reaction was sourced from the sheer irrational panic of possibly being touched by them. It wasn't the first time they had seen it. It likely wouldn't be the last. Curie paid it no mind. Not it, and not the insane assumption that they would actually do something as petty and inane as to step onto their own mish. While they were currently advocating for themselves and how they weren't insane, no less. Instead, the cyborg very calmly lifted their leg up high into a last step, safely moved it over their carrying mish with plenty of air to spare between them, and then set it back down on the other side. They then repeated the motion with their second foremost leg, and they were about to do the same with their middle legs had something not given them pause. There was a pressure around their backmost right leg. Not exactly a strong one, but they felt it clearly as it clung onto their appendage, feeling like it attempted to keep the leg in place. Slowly, Curie shifted their body to look back at their limb to get a visual confirmation of what they could already assume had happened, though they truly had to see it to believe it here. It seemed that instead of just making the vain gesture for them to halt and then pulling their arm back, their vor had actually followed through with their motion. Now, the small teal-coloured hand of the Terravelt was tightly clutched around the cyborg's leg, holding on like their life depended on it. Curie could see Korahoffer tremble the slightest bit as they held onto their leg. However, despite that, it did not seem like they wavered for even a moment on their decision to hold onto their moocher. Ever since they had first seen each other again, and Korahoffer's following attempt to reach for Curie's face had been interrupted, this was the first real contact that either of their parents had made with Curie. For a moment, the cyborg couldn't help but stare. Simply stand there and stare at the tiny hand that finally dared to hold them. A strange feeling arose within them. Curie couldn't even really put a name to it. It was a strange tingling deep inside of them. For a moment, they almost mistook it for happiness at the touch. However, that wasn't it.
Moocher, please.
Korahoffer spoke up slowly, noticing that they had gotten Curie's attention, as they looked up into the cyborg's red eyes.
I'm sorry, I really am. I know we should have never pushed you away. The things that happened to you, they were just too much for us to handle. But I promise, we won't make the same mistakes again. We can fix this. Together.
Their hands squeezed just a little bit tighter, as they smiled up at Curie hopefully, seemingly hoping that they were getting through to their child, now that they had gotten Curie to listen. Curie shifted their weight slightly, positioning their middle legs a bit differently so they could put more strength into moving the backmost ones. Then, they very calmly stated, "You should let go now. The edges of my legs are sharp in places, and Terravelt skin is very sensitive. I wouldn't want to injure you." It took a moment before Korahoffer seemed to fully process what Curie was telling them, but once they did, their previously hopeful expression quite quickly faded away into one that spoke of both confusion and dread.
Moocher?
They asked in a heavily suppressed tone that clearly didn't want to give away just how hard Curie's words had hit them, even if it hadn't been an insult or anything. Still, judging by just their expression alone, the cyborg may as well have rammed one of their legs right through their vor's chest, and it would have been a less painful experience for their parent, as whatever delusion they still had left of reforming their family in a way they imagined crumbled before their very eyes. "Let go," Curie repeated firmly, that strange tingling feeling still remaining at their center. "Let go before you hurt yourself." With that, they began to slowly and carefully lift the leg their vor was holding onto, still very much wishing to not actually cut the amphibian's delicate skin in the process, as they gradually shook off his grip. Korahoffer seemed to hang on more out of instinct than any actual desire to do so for a bit longer, until their hand was lifted so far that it actually threatened to fully lift them off the ground if they held on any longer. Finally, they let go, allowing their arm to fall limply to their side, as if all its strength had left it. During that entire interaction, Farian had remained quietly in place, whimpering a bit as they motionlessly cowered, while Curie's legs and body loomed over them. All of their usual aggressive imperiousness had entirely dissipated from pure terror they were experiencing only in their own head. Curie wasn't even sure if they had actually perceived what had just happened right next to them. However, it didn't particularly concern the cyborg either, as they continued stepping over their mish, making completely sure to not even come close to touching their parent with any of their limbs in the process. Once on the other side, they simply continued walking, picking up their earlier speed again. Behind them, they could now hear how Korahoffer remained frozen in place, where they stood for just a moment longer, before they finally shook off their stupor and dashed to their partner, leaning down to help Farian back onto their own feet. They spoke to each other quietly, but Curie couldn't quite make out the words they were saying to each other. They didn't matter anyway. After just a moment, the cyborg then finally caught back up to their actual pleasant company. Muin had politely waited on the side just like Curie had requested it, though when the cyborg now looked up at the dark-furred Raphaelite, they could see a deep worry and discomfort on his face that was strong enough that they would have picked up on it even before they had spent a lot more time around people. With his claws, the man briefly combed some of the shaggy fur around his neck into place, before then reaching up to drag one of them along his notched horn, causing loud clacking sounds each time that its tip got caught on one of the indents, and subsequently tore free from the pressure.
"Are you, okay?"
Moore's son then finally asked, and his hesitant tone as he did it indicated that questions like that one had not always led to positive reactions for him in the past. However, with Curie, he really did not need to have any fear of overreaction from the cyborg. "Yes, I am fine," Curie replied, as they motioned for him to walk with them again with one of their large legs, though the gesture was supported by one of their small forward arms as well. "Though I will admit I am feeling a bit strange. Though I have also never been the best at matching names to what I feel, so that is not exactly new for me either." The comment was meant to be slightly humorous. However, it appeared to entirely miss its intended effect as Muin's nostrils flared a bit while he released a deep exhale.
"Yeah, I get it. It was a lot like that as well with Sarabi's family when she and I got married,"
he said, seeming to get lost in memories for only a moment, as his dark eyes looked off into the distance. However, he almost immediately snapped out of it again as he quickly shook his head so firmly that his shaggy hair went flying in the process.
"Sorry,"
he then tagged onto his previous words.
"I'm sure you really don't want to hear that right now."
Ignoring his apology, as there really wasn't anything to apologize for in their mind, Curie thought about his words for a moment. "I remember that Moore was really upset about it as well for some time, at least until she got to talk it out with James," they then recalled, really not minding talking about that topic instead of the one that was currently consuming most of their life anyway. Usually they much enjoyed focusing on just one problem until it was figured out and they could move on to the next. However, this specific case certainly functioned as an exception to the rule. Muin exhaled slowly. It was clear that he was torn for a second on whether or not he wanted to engage in this conversation, and thus accept Curie's attempt to use it as a break from the current circumstances of their own life. His wide lips pursed slightly, as he tilted his head to the side to glance down at them with one of his sideways-facing eyes. Finally, he sighed.
"That was something different,"
he then stated, making the decision to go along with Curie's wishes.
"She was upset, yes, but not in the same way. I don't really know how to describe it. Mum was mostly just hurt, I guess, and she just didn't really know how to express that."
By that point, they had finally reached the end of their use of the suspended walkways, turning off it onto a ramp that led towards the ground level of the station far below them, while playful lights still danced around their feet with each step, sometimes mirroring the shape of their feet or the silhouettes of their legs, and other times simply forming a wave-like motion that illuminated the path ahead of them.
Zarabi's family wasn't like that.
Muin continued his thought while they descended the ramp, clearly hesitant to really elaborate on the matter. More like my parents, Curie surmised from both his behavior and the previous statement. Controlling, unaccepting. Muin just nodded with a quiet, sad huff.
Yeah,
He confirmed for the cyborg with a slightly hanging head.
they didn't, they still don't like that I'm not an Estazai, or, not even a core welder for that matter. So they didn't exactly approve of Zarabi's decision to be with me.
Curie nodded their entire body slowly. It must be hard to have someone try to keep you from being with someone you love, they said compassionately, and looked down at their own forward hands for a moment. I have never been in love before. Not sure if I can. But I know what it's like to want to be around someone, and I imagine it is a similar feeling to that, but magnified. After a moment of pause, Muin chuckled slightly.
I think that is a good way to imagine it,
he said, though then he tilted his head slightly and turned thoughtful for a moment.
I never really thought of it, but I guess it is pretty hard to imagine an emotion you've never had.
It is, Curie confirmed calmly. But even if I can't imagine them, I have learned a long time ago that that doesn't make them any less real to the people feeling them, and that the statement, I don't understand the way you feel, does little to resolve a situation. Simply accepting that people feel what they feel is often the best, even if I have to admit that the view of mine is getting challenged a lot recently. Muin nodded his large head again, once more running his claw through his fur.
Yes, I think there are both feelings that you should and feelings that you shouldn't need a good reason to feel, he stated, moving his claw up to scratch along the long chin of his muzzle. I mean, if you love someone for no real reason, then what's the harm in it? But if you hate someone for no real reason, maybe that's worth a bit of a closer look into yourself. I think the difference is that nobody's really going to complain about being loved, with some rather uncomfortable exceptions. But being hated for no reason is far from pleasant, especially if someone decides to act on that hate.
Curie was quiet for a moment as they thought about that. I guess that is a possible way to look at it, though I am not sure if I would trust myself to be the arbiter over which emotions people are allowed to feel and not, they mumbled after a moment, mulling the thought over in their head. Would they be able to figure out which emotions were and weren't all right to feel? Probably not. When looking at it logically, they were sure they would miss some important detail and accidentally forbid someone from feeling something important. Muin chuckled gently again.
True, it's unlikely anyone can be trusted with that,
he concurred with their thoughts, though then he weighed his head a bit as he added,
though the fact that you had that thought and admitted it outright as your first reaction probably means that you are more qualified than most other people already.
Curie paused again. James and Sheeda got very angry when people hated me. Many of my colleagues at Nardi Row also got very angry whenever I told them about how the people in the galaxy generally saw me, they said, not really knowing where they were going with their statement, as they simply felt the need to say it out loud. I think, maybe, it's like what you said about Moore earlier, that they are hurt by it and don't know how else to express it. It was at that moment that they had finally reached the bottom of the ramp. The lights under their feet spread out like ripples across a lake as they touched down on the ground floor of the station, after they had taken their first steps off the ramp.
Yes, possibly,
Muin answered after a second of thought, although he didn't sound entirely convinced of that prospect. I sometimes think about if I should get angry as well. Curie continued their earlier thought as they turned away from the ramp and in the direction that would lead them back to the Rushgak hive. I don't often do. I don't know if it's just how I am, or if it is a side effect of, maybe, nymph, but things that make other people angry rarely do the same for me. I wonder if I would be better off if I got angry more often sometimes, but I don't really think that I want to. Not that I have a choice, but if I could change it, I don't think I would.
Ween looked at the cyborg in a way that seemed like he was befuddled by their words for a moment, cluing Curie in that apparently their train of thought had once again derailed from where most people's would be heading in the current conversation. However, after a bit of adjustment, the Raphaelite man nodded.
You know what? That is a wise way to look at it, he said, going along with Curie's thoughts. Getting angry by itself doesn't really solve any problems. As long as you can still stand up for yourself, you don't need it, I'd say. And you seem to be doing that just fine to me.
Thank you, Curie replied genuinely. We don't know each other that well yet, but it means a lot to me to have your support. Yours and that of your siblings and your wife. I think it is about time I told you that.
They looked up at the Raphaelite as they said it. Then, as their gaze slowly sunk down again, they stopped in place. Taking a second to realize they had stopped, Ween took one more step before stopping as well. Seeming to misinterpret them halting, as them needing a moment of direct reaffirmation, he smiled as he looked back to them.
It is our pleasure, really. I know it may not always seem like it with my sisters, but we are all... Is everything alright?
He began to try to reassure them before seemingly noticing halfway through that the cyborg wasn't actually looking back at him, and that the reason they had paused wasn't actually found within their conversation. In reality, Curie's gaze was fixated onto a place on the ground not too far ahead of them. There, right next to the grey metal wall belonging to a nearby building that seemed to be currently covering a nearby side alley from their vision, they had seen something. In front of and slightly to the side of the wall, right where that side alley's entrance would probably have to be, sparkling lights playfully dipped and waved across the ground, dancing and curling in all matters of shapes and sizes, very clearly indicating that a person had to be nearby to cause the displays along the ground to activate. That by itself wasn't all too strange. People stood in side alleys for all kinds of reasons. That didn't necessarily make anyone suspicious. However, these lights had many functions. Sometimes they form swirls, sometimes they wave like water, and sometimes they mimicked the shape of the person who activated them, with their presence like a reverse shadow. And as Curie's gaze had wandered downwards from Ween's face to look ahead again, they could have sworn... No, they were entirely sure that for a moment they had seen the dancing lights briefly take a concerningly familiar shape. A person of a short stature, with lanky limbs but a stout body, standing slightly hunched over as they had to lean their weight onto a walking aid due to a missing leg. The tingling sensation from before was entirely replaced with a new one. This one wasn't anywhere near as vague, as it instantly felt like millions of small creatures were crawling around just underneath Curie's metal shell, causing the cyborg to shudder briefly.
Are you alright, Curie?
Ween repeated after a moment of getting no reply, and then turned his gaze to follow the direction of Curie's to see what they may be staring at so intensely. Resisting the urge to freeze up completely, Curie shook themselves slightly.
Yes, I am all right,
they said quickly, and began to shift their legs in order to turn on the spot.
I just think we should...
Curie couldn't really think of anything good to say. They didn't want to reveal that they had noticed the familiar person hiding away in the alley, however. Although they didn't quite have such a hardened stance on the truth and nothing but the truth anymore, that by no means meant that they had gotten any good at lying on the spot in the meantime.
Should head the other way,
was all that they eventually got out after any good excuse simply refused to enter their mind.
The other way?
Ween asked in earnest confusion, and for a moment it seemed like he was going to comment on the fact that the way they were currently heading was most certainly the way back to the hive. However, before he had opened his mouth to do so, his confused expression hardened a bit into a suspicious one, as he momentarily followed the previous direction of Curie's gaze again.
Oh, yeah, you're right,
he then said, and loudly clacked his claws against one of his horns, in a gesture that mimicked a mild hit against his head.
If my head wasn't attached to my body, I'd forget that as well. Homeware is probably already sick of waiting for us.
With that, he turned completely as well, and began to walk along with Curie as they headed in the other direction, away from the concealing alley.
Curie was quite thankful that Moeen seemed to have caught on to something being wrong so quickly. It would give them some time to think about what to do next. They should most certainly call James and tell him that.
So those darn lights actually gave me away. I figured without any of the Deathworlders here, it was unlikely that you would notice, but I guess I gave you too little credit. Must be getting rusty.
A familiar, slightly nasal voice suddenly cut through the white noise of the station, after Curie and Moeen had taken their first few steps away. The voice was accompanied by the regular clacking of the reinforced tip of the walking aid, hitting against the station floor with each semi-jumping step that his owner took as he emerged out from the cover of the building's wall. It seemed like their words had not been enough to deceive him, unsurprisingly so. What was surprising, however, was that he would come out of his hiding spot quite so willingly.
Here we are again, Curiosity. A pleasure as always.
Moeen glanced down at Curie momentarily, clearly trying to gather whether they simply wanted to keep walking and ignore the voice like they had done with their parents earlier. However, Curie was already in the process of turning back to look at the owner of the voice. Reprigue looked calm and well-groomed, much unlike the cyborg had seen him many previous times. The pattern of white dots on his sand-coloured fur was clear and defined, as his fur laid flatly on his body without a hint of discomfort. The trunk hanging from his face was also still and dry, with no sign of his usual nervous licking at it being visible. As he noticed that Curie turned around to him, the Sipperslang stopped his approach and shifted his crutch slightly to lean completely down on it, while his one remaining long, flat foot merely provided some balance. The hand not currently holding his crutch fell down to his hip, where a holster was attached with a belt that wrapped around his quite narrow pelvis, holding a clearly visible firearm. Reprigue's hand hovered close to the weapon, but didn't truly reach for it. Instead, it made an almost presenting motion along the length of the gun.
Been a while since we've been in this situation.
The warrant officer, clearly identified as such by the white, bib-like identifier with yellow accents dangling from his neck, said in a tone that was somewhere between mockery and familiar casualness.
Do you want to tell me something about this one as well?
He now gently patted against the side of the gun's barrel. Curie looked down at the weapon as they thought back to the encounter that likely brought on the question from the Sipperslang. That is a Miracoy pistol Model 4 Size 2 of the Galactic Communal Arsenal, a non-hull-safe weapon with high penetration power, especially with the right ammunition. It is mostly meant to be used against specifically armored targets, they said, after looking at the weapon for a long moment to identify its details, like a long yet thin barrel, and a comparatively hefty grip, before lifting their gaze up to look at the man's face. You are correct in your assumption. Unlike the Slugger, that weapon could most certainly injure and even kill me, with the right aim. Reprigue chuckled slightly, as he held the cyborg's gaze with his eyes that bordered on a black colour.
You sure know your weapons,
he said, with a mildly wiggling trunk, while his hand hovered around the gun for a moment longer.
I guess I should have expected you to be so calm about this, but I will admit a part of me was wondering if you were going to freak out.
Curie stared back at him. Their body was still tingling like creatures were crawling all over them. However, they were far from freaking out, at least over the reasons he implied. You are not going to simply shoot me on an open street, they stated categorically. Reprigue specialized in subterfuge and bending situations in his favor. He may have been a murderer, but he wasn't one that would just kill you face to face if he didn't absolutely have to. Reprigue tilted his head slightly for a moment, but then pulled his hand away from the weapon, instead placing it next to his other one on the crutch.
You're right, I won't, he confirmed.
He didn't chuckle that time, but his tone was still amused.
Who would do something like that anyway?
He added, in a tone that was clearly meant to sound like a normal person's reaction to being confronted with the idea of simply shooting someone out in the open. For Curie and Reprigue, it was just an act, but for everyone around them, the warrant officer seemed to at least pretend like he wanted to keep up appearances. What do you want from me, then? Curie asked directly, even if they didn't quite expect a direct answer. It didn't really make sense to them. Why would he reveal himself? Why would he talk to them in such a manner? What was his purpose in being here at all? Was it to kill them again? Then why did he show himself? And why the weapon? Surely he wasn't planning on shooting them at all. Or maybe he was. Was he told to be more direct this time after previous plots to end Curie's life had failed? But why would he reveal himself then? Surely it would be easier to just stay hidden and take the shot. So why would he reveal himself? It was unlikely that he would just give them the answer, but anything he might say could be a possible hint to help them figure it out. Surely you would rather do most anything than converse with an abomination like myself. Reprigue released a slightly wistful sigh, almost as if Curie referring to themselves like he used to do brought back some memories for him.
We were once crewmates, weren't we? I was simply on the station and figured I would come to see you.
The Sipperslang then quite obviously lied.
See how things have been for you. Maybe exchange stories from one amputee to another.
With that, he lifted one hand off his crutch, to then gently pat it against the stump that remained of his leg, after James had destroyed the rest of it to the point that it needed amputation.
But if you don't want to talk, it's not like I'm going to try to force you,
Reprigue then said, in a pretend lamenting tone, as he shrugged and began to laboriously turn with the aid of his crutch.
Though once upon a time, James assured me that you would surely be elated to make a new leg for me.
As they saw him intending to walk away, Curie's mind began to race a light year a minute. It seemed to them like he wanted them to try and stop him. But for what purpose? And would it be smart to give in to his intentions, or would it be wiser to remain stubborn and allow him to walk off? If they kept him around, it would be easier to keep an eye on him, but he would also be one step closer to achieving whatever he wanted to by being close. On the other hand, if they let him walk off, whatever he wanted to achieve may have been further out of his reach, but he would also be out of sight and able to freely move and plan all kinds of other things that may be to their detriment. But more than all that, his last sentence made Curie curious. Even if it was quite obvious bait, it was odd for Reprigue to even consider bringing up such a thing, especially so casually. There was absolutely no way that he actually considered such a thing as a new leg. Even Curie knew that. But that he could get the sentence over his lips without so much as a sign of discomfort. It puzzled Curie, and a puzzle needed a solution. So since things were about 50-50 in Curie's mind on whether it was wiser to keep the man close or to let him go, that curiosity was the final push that brought them towards their decision. "I've not thought much about a prosthetic for a mostly hopping species yet." They spoke the first coherent thought that popped into their head out loud. "I would have to study the intricacies of your ankle joints to make a judgment." Reprigue stopped in his rotation and turned his head back to them before gradually bringing his crutch back around in small steps that alternated between bringing it down and gentle hops with his foot to turn his body completely.
"That can be arranged. I like putting my leg up anyway,"
he then stated, as he began to slowly hobble over to them. "But let's keep things public. I wouldn't want either of us to get the wrong idea." Muin looked down at Curie in uncertainty at this course of action. It seemed that the Raphaelite had recognized Reprigue at this point. However, Curie indicated that it was fine with a calming motion of their leg. "Surely you won't mind if I inform James about this meeting on our way?" they then asked Reprigue, to which the Sipperslang immediately snickered and shook his head in a way that made his trunk sway.
"Not at all. I've yet to congratulate him on his recent successes," he said, in that same casualness bordering on mockery from earlier. "That and his birthday. Humans celebrate that, don't they?"
"They do," Curie confirmed thoughtfully. "I wonder how he might react to your well wishes."